Air Canada is cancelling 30 domestic routes and shutting down operations at 8 regional airports. The airline says these steps are necessary because the demand for travel has dropped during the pandemic. The cancelled routes originate in Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. Company executives say air travel is not likely to pick up in the near future because of government-imposed travel restrictions and border closures. The airline says it expects the industry's recovery to take at least 3 years. It says it will consider other changes, including more service suspensions in the coming weeks. So for more on this, I want to bring in David Duval. He's a professor in the Faculty of Business and Economics at the University of Winnipeg. His focus includes commercial air transport regulation. David, thank you for joining us on this really important topic. How big a deal is this?
It's fairly substantial, Hannah. Thank you very much, by the way. It is fairly substantial. It's going to mean a great deal for some of these smaller communities for whom some services are obviously going to be concluding. I think what Air Canada is doing is they're wrestling with the ability to address the new operating environment that they're facing. And they're not alone, of course. Other airlines around the world and, of course, here in Canada are facing that new operating reality. And they're trimming what often are called thin routes, where demand, as they've pointed out in their press release, demand is just not sufficient to warrant those services to continue.
So what is Air Canada telling the traveling public, as well as the people who live in these places like Bathurst, New Brunswick, North Bay, Ontario? These are small communities, not only those two communities, but now people are feeling isolated.
Yeah, that would be a pretty logical conclusion that they would arrive at. I think the good news is, and I've seen this before in other countries, is that when a large dominant carrier exits a particular market, exits a particular route, what can sometimes happen is smaller carriers can pick up the slack, so to speak. Now, those smaller carriers have to be convinced that there is a market. And what we're wrestling with right now is trying to figure out whether customers and passengers are comfortable with flying to the extent that it makes those particular routes profitable.
Now, what we're hearing from our reporter, Cameron McIntosh, is that Air Canada is even getting rid of some of its airlines. So, for people who might be sitting back going, okay, well, Air Canada will come back eventually. If they've gotten rid of the vehicle or the mode of transportation, then it's not likely they're going to come back. Am I right in that assessment?
In a sense, yes. I think what Air Canada ultimately has to do, they're coming back from almost a reset at zero. And this is substantial for them because they have very expensive assets that they have to position across their network. And airlines utilize what's called yield management. So that's figuring out where to position an aircraft, where to sell a seat, how much to sell that seat for. And they use forecasting to determine where to best position those aircraft. And right now, all forecasting models are pretty much out the door because they're addressing a new reality, and they won't be alone.
If you can look into your airline crystal ball, what will it look like for passengers in these, more remote communities down the road?
I think alternate forms of or alternate modes of transportation is probably going to be called for a lot of those smaller communities on those particular routes. I think that's just a potential reality that they will be facing for the near term. How long that near term is, I really couldn't say, but I'm hoping that further out, several years out, we could see hopefully some of those services return.
Now, do you think the federal government should play a role here?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was actually speaking with a colleague in New Zealand this afternoon about that, and we were talking about how in Europe, for instance, there are what's called public service obligations where the European Union will underwrite or subsidize services to a bidder in an auction that offers to, say, fly between 2 points within Europe or within a particular country. Are we going down that pathway yet? I don't think the federal government would be in a position just quite this moment to address something like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if something like that gets discussed because some of these routes can be lifelines for some of these smaller communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, so is there any potential for Air Canada to declare bankruptcy because of the pandemic?
I don't think so. No, I don't think the federal government will let that happen, nor should they, quite frankly. Air transport is absolutely vital for economic development, and it's going to be incredibly vital for getting us out of this pandemic as we hopefully move into that direction. And I don't think Air Canada is generally in a reasonably comfortable position, or it's fairly, before the pandemic, it had a liquidity status that wasn't terribly bad. But it's facing some headwinds, if I can use an aviation analogy. And I think it's going to be difficult, but I have confidence. They're a very well-managed airline.
I think for some of these smaller communities, they might be scared and thinking, I know I'm from a smaller community, the airline went, then the train went, and then the bus went, and the only way in and out is car. Do you see that for some of these communities as well? Like, it's just done?
That's a difficult question to answer. I would hope not. I mean, we already are addressing the issues with respect to rural versus urban in Canada in terms of internet access, for instance, and that's hitting hard in terms of education of children, and we're seeing disparities there. I would hate to see smaller communities become even more isolated than they want to be. I would hope that there is going to be at least a trend where we can provide some kind of services, or as I said before, we can have even a smaller operator operating smaller aircraft, not necessarily daily services, but certainly a couple of times a week, at least start to provide that lifeline.
Might just need a little bit of time, eh?
I think so.
Okay. David Duvall, thank you for your insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate it.
Happy Canada Day.
Happy Canada Day.
Yeah. Professor David Duvall from the University of Winnipeg. Thanks so much.